true value creation for you, but then in that way also for society, because it can lasting value, is far more aligned with addressing the overshoot pressures than people believe. So that gives me also the sense of there's much more possibility. Why are we so convinced that is not the case? And I think I see that even talking within the environmental movement, we are so convinced it is a free rider problem where people have to give themselves up for humanity and they will not get anything back, that we cannot see the other possibilities. But I think without being able to show advantages, it's very hard to gather enough momentum to make that happen. And I think that also increases the opportunities to build stories that generate more empathy rather than cynicism. If your ask is, please give yourself up, you don't get anything back, and then see others that don't participate, most people become cynical, and that just it becomes erosive. But if you actually recognize that this is an investment in your own ability to be resource secure by knowing how to live with fewer resources, you invest in yourself.
Hi, welcome back to Code Green, conversations for the future we want and our kids deserve. So do our grandkids, now that I'm a new grandmother. I am pleased to welcome back to my microphone Matthijs Wackernagel, who has been early days working to make people aware of the outsized footprint, among other things, that we Americans have on our poor planet, suffering more and more each year. And he is the founder of the Global Footprint Network and co-founder of Earth Overshoot Day, if I got that right. And Global Footprint Network goes back to 2003. Maybe you were co-founder, but you started it. I know that.
That's a good summary.
Yeah. I think that this is one of the most important stories that's not getting told on network news. I pitched this exact story several times when I was trying to get CNN, MSNBC, NBC interested in a show. It would be the first one on their airwaves that just might help save ourselves, humanity. Hello.
Yeah.
They weren't interested. And when they said they weren't interested in this story, and it's not like they did it last week, I said there's really something wrong. And of course there is, but subject for another day. The point is, I really think that this really shows how we're so out of balance, unsustainable, and not getting better. And to tell us more, Matthijs, please tell us where it began, uh, the first day, and what's happened to it since,
Yeah.
and why I keep missing it because I keep looking at for it later in the year, calendar year, and it keeps sneaking up on us.
Thank you, Betsy. It's wonderful to be back here in conversation with you. A lovely show. Really appreciate. And yeah, I mean, Overshoot Day does really well everywhere but the United States. And it's kind of an interesting question. Why is that the case? Uh, and still, I would say like global overshoot, ecological overshoot, which essentially means we are using more than what Earth can renew. It's really at the center of why we're even talking about sustainability. I mean, otherwise we just talk about development, but
Which is what
why
most
do we?
people are talking about in America
Yeah,
still.
maybe, but so when we talk about sustainable development, I mean, it's a recognition there's a planetary constraint we have to kind of be cognizant of, and otherwise we just could expand further. But so Overshoot would say that's the biggest threat of humanity. Actually, we say it's the second biggest threat for humanity in the 21st century. The biggest threat is not to respond. And that's actually
Yeah.
what we seem to do. So there's no disadvantage understanding overshoot. I think that was one of the big mistakes in the early kind of or early environmental or climate movement. That I mean, I won't blame it, but I think like Al Gore called his movie "The Inconvenient Truth," and I think that's how people hold the information. Oh, how inconvenient! I'm better off not knowing. Actually, it's the other way around. Understanding your context better has no downsides. And so overshoot is not your burden, it's just your context. It's the context in which we live, which helps you understand why kind of things happen the way they happen, why the future is far more predictable or more predictable than ever, you could say, because we always knew we would eat in the future and sleep in the future and move about in the future. So we know about the future quite a bit. And now we also know with quite a lot of clarity that in any possible scenario, any imaginable scenario, there will be more climate change and and fewer resources. That's just the way it will be. So knowing that is helpful because then we can prepare for that future. We can say, okay, what's going to be valuable in that future? That's what we should focus on because that will help us operate in that future. And just to say, no, I don't want to know, actually, you hurt yourself
And everybody else and those to come.
and everybody else and those to come as well. But I think, and yourself as well. So it's not just I think it is a big misconception, perhaps. I mean, it is important to talk about how we also impact others. And at the same time, I think it feeds into this underlying story that people think, oh, yeah, I have to be good for humanity, but what do I get back? Like, why should I give myself up for the others? When the future is getting so difficult, even more so, why should I give myself up? And it's actually not like that. It's if you recognize that future, the most effective way to react is to prepare yourself for the future. And the most effective way to prepare yourself is actually not bunker mentality. It's doing things that others can do as well, because that doesn't run into constraints. It doesn't run into conflicts with others. It can be done with others. It prepares you, but it opens possibilities for others. So acknowledging what is only has upsides.
Forewarned is forearmed. That's an old saying, but it has new meaning all the time.
Mhm.
And of course, many scientists and activists have been trying to warn the greater public for, well, I've been doing this 28 years. You've been at it how long in the green
Oh, I mean,
sector?
I've been interested in these topics since childhood in some ways, but then I did my PhD on the topic when the footprint was developed. We developed the footprint in like 1990. That's like 35 years ago. My goodness, don't tell me.
Tell me about it. I know. My daughter was born in 1994. I
There you
started
go.
Trash Talk Minutes when she was 2, and my granddaughter will be 2 in November. That's how long I've been at this. And in many ways, we've progressed in terms of informing, educating, engaging the public. And in many ways, we have not reached nearly enough of the citizenship
Mm,
nationally and globally to move the needle. And of course, now we feel like we're going backwards because
mm.
it's no illusion. There are people in charge right now in America that are actively, knowingly taking us backwards, and that to me should be criminal. It's crime against humanity, crimes against nature. Uh, we talk a lot about this on this program, but mostly we focus on what we can do about it. But before we get to that, let's talk about the fact that this year broke a record. It was the earliest Earth Overshoot Day, I think, since you've been keeping track.
Yeah, not by much, but it's a bit earlier than before.
July
Uh,
24th, just passed.
it's a little bit earlier than before. But even if we stayed at the same level, it means like within 7 months. So what Earth Overshoot Day means, just to kind of explain in simple ways,
Yeah.
essentially, we can easily do it. It's like bookkeeping. It is bookkeeping. We are bean counters in the real sense of counting the beans and the potatoes and the milk and the CO2 and everything. So you can basically say on the supply side, how much area do we have in the world that is productive to provide all these things that we need, or we use, like fish, milk, tomatoes, etc. How much area is there to provide that? And then you can also compare that with how much do we actually use and how much area is necessary to provide this flow. And then you can compare to an extent the flow that we demand fits within what we have available. And what the counts show is that currently our demand exceeds by about 80%. And that's a conservative estimate. We can go into that why, but it's a conservative estimate of 80%. By 80%, we overuse what Earth can renew. And
80%, not
by
8%, 80.
80. And
But the
so a
cost
little
is
bit
so
under
low.
80%. Yeah. And so you can translate that also, that number, to saying if you spend 80% faster your income than what you earn, ecologically speaking or financially speaking, then from January 1st to July 24th in this calendar year, you use as much as Earth can renew in the entire year. So, and then you could also say, actually, even if you spend everything of the year, that wouldn't be totally good, because there are also other species that want to use resources. So using the entire budget may not be the ideal either, but we're not even getting it down to the entire budget. We use 80% more. Anyhow, so Earth Overshoot Day, that's the day by which we have used up the budget for the year at the global level. And then even if we stayed at that level, that still means every year within 7 months we've used up the budget, and we add more of that deficit to the ecological debt. So the ecological impact really is a cumulative process, not just how much we did last year, but it's historically how much we have overused. And when we look, for example, at the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, it's like a bathtub that we have been filling up and now it's full. And so what happens if we do more? I mean, it's just it accumulates to more. So yeah, it would be good to see as a trend that our pressure is starting to go down. We don't see that yet, but we're still at a very high level. And then at the same time, we can say with great certainty, because that's the law of physics, overshoot will end. That's no question. The question is only how. So how do we choose? Do we choose a path by design and say that's kind of the way we want to go and we are in control, or do we let disaster reign? So design or disaster, that's the choice. Probably most people here and anywhere would say design is better than disaster. But again, that would take a bit of effort to then do it. Probably it's going to be a combination of the two, but it will end.
It reminds me to make a simpler comparison, there's now technology so you can get a full body scan or a blood test that can tell you if you have early signs of cancer, multiple kinds of cancer. And you can divide people into those who really want to know and are grateful if they're lucky enough to afford it, because there's not much coverage yet to get it and to know, and those who I don't want to know, what could I do about it? But of course, in most medical conditions, knowing about it and there is almost something you can do about it, hopefully ward it off or the worst of it or prolong the onset. That's it. Putting our heads in the sand is never a good idea. Maybe a couple of days a year or sometimes occasionally, but we're kind of doing it nationally, globally, almost every day. And in fact, there's so much talk, especially in this Republican Party in charge and on the news networks about the national debt and deficit. They never talk about the ecological debt. And that's what we're really saddling our kids with. And they're so
Well, it must, yeah.
how can we leave this to our kids? And I'm going, it's the climate, stupid. It's the environment, stupid. That's the one that's going to get us.
And I must say, I do appreciate the financial debt problem as well. I mean, like that's leaving debt to the future. So there's actually much more peril. And if we run into more financial debt, then we think the only way we can make it up is kind of cranking the economy more and using more resources. So it's kind of it feeds both itself. So I think being conservative in the sense of maintaining our planet and maintaining financial balance is not a bad idea.
Talking about parallel universes, I mean, they still are talking mostly in the news that I'm a former news one, I can't watch it, but my husband has it on a lot, MSNBC or CNN, and they're talking about, oh, yay, the GDP is up 2.5%. And they're celebrating that when those of us who are aware of the downside of that, ecological, and the whole degrowth movement, I don't know if you have comments about that. It's like, oh my gosh, still living in a parallel universe. Like people, if you knew, you wouldn't be celebrating that GDP because that, of course, includes a lot of negative things. I used to say like prison,
Mm,
payphones, but I don't even think they have payphones in prison anymore. But
mm,
all traffic accidents, disease, all those things.
mm.
Most Americans aren't aware of that.
That's absolutely true. Yeah. I mean, on some ways, how we run our economy, we have built it in a way that we depend on that expansion. Otherwise, it becomes unstable. So it's nothing short of a Ponzi scheme, what we are running. Like, so we depend on being able to deplete the future to pay for the present. And while you can run the Ponzi scheme, like, I don't know if you remember Bernie Madoff went on his luxury tours in his big yacht.
Yeah, I
So
know.
as long as it can maintain that illusion, it's great party. But the danger is not like, do we want to grow or do we not want to grow? But what happens if we cannot grow? So we have now a system that will not be able to persist. And if it doesn't persist, it becomes very unstable. So it's really, we're hurting ourselves by doing it.
We're growing into
Funnily, like
what?
Ponzi scheme, typically people are put in prison for that, typically. But this is one that we encourage collectively somehow, and it's odd.
This is an odd moment indeed. And who would have thought that, with all the extreme weather events we've had and there being an environmental factor
Mm,
to pandemics like
mm,
COVID, even though the average American isn't aware of
mm,
that. And during COVID, some of us were rooting for people to stay home, don't fly, don't drive, and hoping that that would be a turning point that people would realize when the animals came out of the woods that and the sky was clean and the birds were singing that maybe there's something we can do. And I always say, and if the news organizations covered climate like they did COVID and showing the emergency that it is and how quickly behavior can
mm,
change globally, we might be a lot further along. But instead, we're in Trump 2.0. And this time around, the Republicans, aren't even pretending that they care or taking care of our environment. It's just scorched earth. And every day it's something new. And for those of us in the know, it's very, very difficult to pick up our phones. You can't hide from the news anymore. how do you cope with this moment when we thought we were making progress that was way too slow, under Obama and Biden? And I'm not slamming Republicans other than the fact that not one of them voted for the Climate Act. I mean, Republicans are the party that politicized climate change, never should have been, and they continue to in 2025. And I think that should be a crime, ecocide.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think because I can only control what's in within inside me, my body, how I move my fingers, how I move my lips, etc. The question is like, what can I do differently? And I think in some ways where the environmental movement may get stronger or clear is that I think we have chosen a not very effective narrative on some level. And I
Mhm.
mean, I'm on some level, I have been surprised. Like if I thought like 20 years ago, I wouldn't have made the bet that climate change would become the big story, because it's quite abstract. You don't see CO2 in the air, like you can't smell CO2. It's like emotionally not so convincing like the CO2. And still, the climate change story has become front and center of the environmental movement. And
And a lot
but
of
there's a
money,
down and
a
there's
lot
a
of money.
downside to it, and I think the downside is the following. By focusing just on climate change, we focus on a dynamic that economists would call a free rider problem. So the dynamic means to reduce my CO2 emissions, I have to make an effort, and the benefit goes to humanity. And so it kind of the whole storyline, we never say that because it doesn't sound nice, but the whole storyline is I have to give myself up for humanity. And well, it's a nice thought and would be morally superior, but it's hard to get the majority of the population to say that's what I want to do. And so there's a lot of nice talk, but very little action.
which,
And
which
I think it's also a misconception. So luckily, I would say, if you actually look at all environmental concerns packaged together, we are not trapped in a free rider problem. It's exactly the opposite. And that's what we call overshoot. Overshoot is a way to look at all the demands combined that put pressure on the planet. If you look at the world from that perspective, it becomes obvious that the world is nearly the opposite. That if that's our context, and I think that's our context, if you, Betsy, or you, Oakland, or you, California, or you, company, whoever you are, if you are not ready for that future, you will be not ready. You will not be able to operate well.
mm,
So actually, if we go to more and more conferences and say, oh, the others don't do anything. Now the news reports that as, oh my God, the others don't do anything, can't do anything. We have to wait another year till the next conference. It's exactly the opposite. The less other people prepare themselves for that inevitable future, which comes even faster if we don't act. The less they prepare, the
prophecies.
higher is the higher is Betsy's risk, the higher is California's risk, the higher is whoever you are's risk. So the incentive to prepare yourself gets even stronger. So it's the exact opposite story that I think we haven't been able to help people see. Like if the others don't want to act, that makes it even more important for you to prepare yourself. And
So
what does it mean to prepare yourself? It's not bunker mentality. People say, "Oh, prepare yourself." These preppers,
survivalists, there's a whole survivalist movement.
survivalist. And then, like, for example, like prepping, like in that sense, you say, okay, therefore I have to move to New Zealand because they have a lot of land. That's not a replicable strategy. If everybody, like the 8 billion people say, oh, wow, we have to move to New Zealand, it doesn't work.
Keep
So,
going north, keep going north.
and then you have to
Oh,
go
well,
to,
at the
yeah.
Arctic,
But I
oh, there's
think
no
the
more
point is,
Arctic. Oh, darn.
but the point is that so these are non-replicable strategies. They're not really that effective. But if the strategies to prepare yourself are ways that you can make yourself more resource secure, less dependent on large resource flows, like for example, in getting more renewable energy, putting PV on a roof, having better insulated houses, living in houses that are closer to where you need to go, so you don't have to move about that much, etc. All these things are replicable and improve your ability to live well.
Okay, so many directions.
Yeah.
I want to ask you first. I mean, Americans
Yes.
do have the biggest per capita footprint. China overall has the most emissions, but aren't we still superpower in that regard?
Of course, we have superpower. And I mean, per person, there are countries that have even higher demands than the United States. You can look at that. I mean, that's kind of on a per person basis. I think like particularly countries in the Gulf region, or even like very high income countries in Europe, like Luxembourg per capita have even higher uh, footprints than the United States, but they're small countries.
Right.
So yeah, but then another interesting way is to also look how much you have compared to how much you use. So different countries have different amount of biocapacity. For example, in Switzerland, where I come from originally, has about only 1/4 of the biocapacity of its own demand. So it takes 4 Switzerlands to support Switzerland. In Germany, the ratio is about factor three. So in the United States, uh, we have, I think, about twice as much demand as we have biocapacity because we have a pretty large country.
Yes, we do.
So,
And,
so
and, and half of it doesn't believe that climate change is a real threat or why we
that's
have
that
growth cancers.
that is surprising. But I mean, there's also that opportunity. You could say, okay, how would we actually have to structure ourselves so we would have a future? So I think if I look at like the themes, also politically speaking, that became prominent also in the last election, 2024, many of these themes are very strongly related to overshoot. Like, for example, if you look at inflation is physically, I think, can come out of overshoot if it becomes more difficult to fill the stores because it's harder to get stuff, because transportation is harder and we are more like there's more demand meeting a smaller planet. That reflects in higher prices. So it's harder to fill the stores. That's inflation, and so that's what people were worried about. We want energy, but then if the only reaction is, okay, let's pump more oil out of the ground, we make ourselves even more dependent on a way of living that won't work. So it should actually ring a bell and say, oh my goodness, we have to do it differently because otherwise we put ourselves in
But
more danger. But many of the themes are actually kind of, I think, come out of this recognition that we have become big compared to the planet, and so we're in a more competitive mood, but we don't know how to react. And so the knee-jerk reactions are nearly are counterproductive. They're not really helping to put us in a stronger place.
And I know people who either maybe denial is not so common. It's hard to imagine anyone truly being in denial. All you have to do is Google it or chat GPT it. Now, there's no excuse to be ignorant, but yet some are.
Yeah.
Proudly so, it seems. But, there was a day, last century, well, 2 centuries ago, maybe before, I don't know, 1900, where, the world really seemed unlimited in terms of its size and resources, and the population nationally, globally, was much smaller. But, obviously things shifted, especially as we, thanks to fossil fuels, became more developed and, manufactured and grow and thrive for a while. It was pretty good for a couple of decades there till it started backfiring. And I think people for a long time just couldn't imagine how human beings could have such an impact. But it seems obvious once you understand what's going on, the greenhouse effect. And of course, it's not just climate, it's the oceans, which impacted by climate change. It's
Mm.
it's a cycle and reinforcing, what's the expression
And probably for people like me and you, we think in our life experience, it seems normal. I think if all the fossil fuels ever burned in human history, 85% of it has been burned in my lifetime. You
that's
know?
right.
So,
When you think about
and since the turn of the century, like that's not like, or probably if you look at the age of your daughter who just became a mother, I think in her life, it may be in the 65% range, I could look it up, of
yeah.
all the fossil fuels ever
And another
used.
number that I try to share with people that I think is pretty dramatic is if you tell them that the, world's best scientists say, experts in their field, atmospheric climate scientists, that the safe level for parts per million of greenhouse
Mhm.
gases in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, methane, is 350. And then I say, so where do you think we are now? And well, I don't know. Ever heard of Bill McKibben? I don't know. We're at like 430 parts per million now. And have you noticed, look out your window, weather's not the same.
Mm.
I grew up in the Bay Area. It's much windier, which of course feeds the wildfires and the droughts and all that, that feedback loop. But I just think that because my focus and my whole career was in news, I really think, the news media in general has just done a really poor job of connecting these dots. Look at the last election. Yeah, and education is needed because everyone's talking about the price of eggs and groceries and oh my God, and like it's all Biden's fault. Like he could just, wave a wand,
Mm.
make the prices go up or down. And those of us in the know say, I got news for you. Food prices are going to continue to rise in part because not only transportation costs, but also crop damage from derechos and drought and fires and floods, not to mention what insurance companies are now not covering in many areas, growing number of areas in the country. Like it's more expensive to not do anything than to do everything we can. And yet we are going backwards. So how do you cope, Matisse, with the daily onslaught of news that's difficult to our sensibilities?
I mean, I think like what I start to recognize, and I wish I had recognized early in my career. I knew about it, but I hadn't kind of thought what the implications are. Something Rebel Rouser, California Rebel Rouser from the 20s. The quote is, "If your income depends on not understanding,
You
it's
said it
very hard to
well.
understand."
Al Gore uses that quote a lot, but I don't think he was the
Yeah, yeah.
of
No,
that. I've heard him say it enough times I should remember who you're talking about. But hey, Newsheimers, all these
it's
stories end it for me.
Upton Sinclair.
Yeah, thank you. And it's true.
Upton Sinclair.
Yes, it's true.
Yeah. So and so I mean, but basically this says I think we need to understand that people's brain is not looking for reason, it's looking for advantage. So actually have compassion with people who deny climate change because really they just think I don't think they have better insight into climate change. They just think it's so that therapy is worse than a disease. So how can we make sure the therapy will not be applied? And I think that's their misconception. It's their misconception.
Education.
And so I'm starting to look at like in my work, looking more at who is more aligned with the interests in some ways. So it's not about like can we convince everybody, but how can I support those who kind of want to prepare themselves for the inevitable? And it's good for them, and it's good also for the world. So I think we can do it from an investment perspective. So I would believe like when we talk with the investors or like businesses, that actually the alignment between self-interest and preparing yourself meaningfully to the new context we're in is far, far more aligned because the question is the following, as I said earlier, what's going to be valuable in that future, and
And
what's going to be the most valuable things are things that can actually operate in that future because value and utility has some correlation, not a total correlation, but things that are not too useful will not be too valuable. And then you can even go a step further and say, what will be the most valuable things? And I would say it's the things that when you have more of global overshoot goes down, you think that's not possible. Like you have a car factory, you make more cars make more overshoot. But actually there are things like, for example, I mean, just to simplify, if you build windmills, that takes resources. But then if these windmills displace coal power, overshoot goes actually down. Or
Mhm.
if you effectively recycle aluminum cans or whatever, like that actually, rather than getting fresh aluminum, then you rescue resources. And so by doing that more of the resources are being saved. So it's not possible to do for every company, but those who can do it and those who have had a business model to do it, they are much more likely at gaining in value because they will not run into constraints. They will be needed more. They will not get into cost pressures because they provide something that will be needed. So actually, fundamental business strategy is much more aligned with fundamental sustainability requirements. We just need to start to ask the question much more. I think that's kind of also a little bit of a blind spot of the sustainability movement that too much is talked about. Oh, how should things be produced and how should it be produced? I think the more fundamental question is what's being produced, because that dictates much more kind of the resource requirements that are associated, and how it's being produced is only a part of that. Because in the end, like companies, like the question is like, how much overshoot be different in the world if your company did not exist? If because of the existence of your company, overshoot goes down, you'll be needed, you
Mhm.
know? I mean, so anyhow, so this kind of you can show this link value creation, true value creation for you, but then in that way also for society because it can lasting value is far more aligned with addressing the overshoot pressures than people believe. So that gives me also the sense of there's much more possibility. Why are we so convinced that is not the case? And I think I see that even talking within the environmental movement, we are so convinced it is a free rider problem where people have to give themselves up for humanity and they will not get anything back, that we cannot see the other possibilities. But I think without being able to show advantages, it's very hard to gather enough momentum to make that happen. And I think that also increases the opportunities to build stories that generate more empathy rather than cynicism. If your ask is please give yourself up, you don't get anything back, and then see others that don't participate, most people become cynical, and that just it becomes erosive. But if you actually recognize that this is an investment in your own ability to be resource secure by knowing how to live with fewer resources, you invest in yourself. as well as good for humanity, then you will feel pity for the others who don't know how to do it. They're like, so more empathy raising. So, oh, poor people that don't know how to kind of
Well,
operate in this world. And so I think it's that may be a more healthy way of moving forward and less confrontational.
is what you're saying kind of like, well, altruism didn't work. We tried Save the Planet, 50 Simple Things to Do. All that did not get the zeitgeist enough. But what I say is, well, don't watch my interviews. It's really not for everyone. Only those who eat, breathe, or drink.
Yeah, it's true.
And yeah,
Yeah. If you don't
and
need a planet, then don't waste your time with me. Yeah.
it's selfish to care and do something, especially for parents and grandparents. I don't know if you're a father, but boy, being a Jewish mother, now grandmother, I worry so much when I see the math, what's going to be like, and 20, uh, all these milestones, and it's like, oh my gosh, I'm holding future generations in my arms again, just like when I had my daughter 30 years ago, and now this baby, and given what's going on politically, it's. I wanted to say several things. You talked about maybe we need to be aware so we can adapt, but of course, we need to mitigate at the same time, right?
Oh, certainly. I just think like if I've become much more friendly to adaptation for a number of reasons. One is once you adapt, you actually start to acknowledge there's a problem. You know,
Backwards. Okay, go backwards. Yeah.
oh
Yeah.
wow, why would you adapt if there wasn't a problem? You know, so it's actually acknowledging, oh, there's something happening. The second thing is, I mean, adaptation sounds a bit lame because, oh, we adapt a little bit. But in some ways, I believe if you truly adapt and say, wow, I have to kind of adjust to this situation, we probably will get much more mitigation benefit from it because people really believe it and say, this is necessary for me and it's for humanity. So I think this segregation between mitigation and adaptation hasn't really served us. It has kind of just kind of kept the purists on one side and the others are afraid on the other side. That's why I kind of think preparation may be a better term because it says this is a new world. If you're not ready for this world, you won't be ready. It's like, oh, we'll be thrown into the ocean. Is it good to learn how to swim if you know that you'll be thrown in the ocean? Probably it's good for you to learn how to swim, you know? I mean, like this, it's at that basic level. Do you know what I mean? I'm use that as kind of an allegory, but like we do as if, oh no, it's voluntary whether we accept that there will be overshoot on it. No, it's not whether you listen to it or not. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. Why why would you not want to understand the forces that will shape your ability to operate?
And I don't think the average American understands what's happening to our ocean between acidification, oceans on acid from the carbon dioxide greenhouse gases being absorbed by the carbon sink. The sewage is how Gore says we're treating it. Um, the sewer, I should say. But it's the plastic, it's the overfishing,
And
it's
it's this last link. I mean, understanding what's happening, then how that actually also will affect them and their children and their grandchildren in direct ways. It's not in abstract ways, I think. I think, wow, this actually really matters. Like if I don't understand that, then I'm at a disadvantage. I may invest in the wrong things. I may buy the wrong real estate. I may live in the wrong place. You know, so
and yet we're going backwards right now. I mean, I know environmentalists, and this kills me. They're giving up. And I have been close in this last 6 months. Really,
no,
really. Well, writing my book
yeah,
about how mainstream news has,
yeah.
election of duty. I want to sue Fox. Seriously, they're still lying about climate change. Fox not news. And
Mhm,
when people say, well, there's a First Amendment, Bessie, you can't do that. I say, well, there's exceptions. And one of them is reckless disregard for the truth
mhm,
of the public. And don't you think that if people get their information primarily from Fox, and that is still the most popular network
mhm,
figure, and 95% of all radio, I think, is still right wing, they're being told lies. Basically, it's not a problem. Continue business as usual, consume. And, Democrats are lying and Biden's the devil and all this crap that ignores that this is in all of our self-interests, regardless of political party. It's that the disconnect. So if you don't think climate change is a real threat, you might not evacuate because you've been, all the victims, not all, almost always, because I watch this stuff and record it for a book someday or a lawsuit. The victims always say one thing, the signature line. What is it? It's, we've never seen anything like this. Or who would have thought? So Trump has the nerve to go down to Texas, horrific disaster, 7 and 8 year old children being swept away in the middle of the night. What a nightmare. But I lived in Texas for 7 years, and you don't have to live in Texas to know that Governor Abbott, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, Trump and Ted Cruz at all on the Republican side. Because Beto was a good guy. We volunteered for him twice, but when he lost twice, I kind of gave up on Texas. They don't talk about it. They won't even mention it for sure, not in this context. And if they don't talk about it, then people continue to call it an act of God, natural disaster. When I correct it, say it's an unnatural disaster. It's not nature's fault that she's, you know, spitting up on us. We are fueling her. And if people don't understand we're in a new era of weather on steroids, they won't take proper precautions. And that's where I think there could be a public interest lawsuit if they didn't know because they got their news from a source that is telling them there's no problem. And we're just a bunch of, alarmists. What do you think?
It's very hard to convince people. And it's like religious conversions happen very seldom, for example, from a religious perspective. But even if people were wrong, as an example, I don't know if you saw that part of the news, what did the father say of the first child that died of measles? Did you see that? Like the quote. They didn't say, "Oh my God, I was wrong. I should have vaccinated." They said that was God's will. God wanted to have my daughter back, you know? So I mean, if you would accept, like if you said, "Oh yeah, I should have vaccinated," you would actually accept that you had something to do with that horrific tragedy, you know? So it's
Ideology kills people. People were dying, Republicans mostly were dying of COVID and not be willing, and they were unwilling to accept that it was COVID that was killing them or it had something to
because our
do.
we're so in love with our own identity in some way. So anyhow, so that's kind of this is a psychological reality. So that's why I think for me, like the storyline, I tried to shift the storyline a little bit from that perspective of saying, helping to explain what's the implication of overshoot. And I would say overshoot is the biggest market failure that we have seen. What does it mean? Like if you have a functioning market, for example, for bread, if there are too few bakers, bread gets expensive and people say, oh, that's now an opportunity to become a baker. There's more bakeries open and the bread price goes down again. So that's like how the market self-regulates. But with overshoot, there doesn't seem to be any market regulation whatsoever. Actually, the cheaper the resource become, the more we use, and we're just going crazier and crazier. So it's a market failure. Now you could say market failures will hurt people. How much? You could say the following to say, how much higher would the price need to be for the resources so the demand would go down to a level that is sustainable? That price would be so high, it would probably crash the global economy, which shows that the global economy depends on a resource flow it cannot afford. And that shows the fragility.
The
So,
subsidizing of gas and oil.
market failures, they eventually will balance out whether you like it or not. So whether you like it or not. So you can see either it happened through a gradual shift, which is more easy to deal with, or through large disruptions. But having seen that, then you can say, okay, actually, who has the cards in their hands? I would say it's countries that still have extra resources. So to me, it's inevitable that there will be a power shift among countries between those who don't have the resources and those who have the resources. Now it's still the other way around. Like, for example, China is negotiating with South America. China uses 3 times more than what they have within their own boundaries. South America has extra, and they just set it off as if they wouldn't have any other choice. Like so I think, but that's inevitable to go to shift. And so if you want to have a comfortable life, and you don't prepare your economy for that reality, it's just suicidal. I think it's kind of like any country that doesn't have resource security at the core of its economic development plan, it really is on a suicidal track. I don't have to go and convince them. I'd rather work with those who kind of recognize that and then move forward and strengthen them because that's good for them and it's good for the world. You know?
And it's not good for the world ecocide. And you know what we're in the midst of committing. And Europe, of course, just made
Mhm.
encouraging move in saying that states should be held accountable if they are knowingly killing off nature, which all of our states, countries, whatever entities are. It's a step, I guess, towards making ecocide a crime. It's not quite there yet, but if you're wondering what we're talking about, go to Ecocide International. They've got a lot of information on this positive development amid all the negative ones in the past couple
Mhm.
of weeks. The thing that always gets me is thinking about developing countries wanting a better way of life, and electricity. And like as long as they want, maybe not quite America's way, because I think the world's starting to see that we're a little dysfunctional in many ways, but they want more and they deserve more. The global South, didn't cause these problems. They're not living in McMansions and driving SUVs, yet they're the ones getting hit first and worst. As long as they understandably, deservedly want a better way of living, and they're trying to be more like us and less like they are, bad, just the luck of where you're born and timing, how do we win?
So first of all, yeah, let's think of strategies that are actually winnable. So that's kind of, I think, one of also where the environmental movement, I think, has fallen short, that we're not, I'm not convinced that we have those strategies that are winnable. And then the second thing I think is also because you start to talk about solution, that's kind of what a wiser elder told me. She said, like, because I was always a bit nervous about the word solution because solution doesn't have a subject, so it's like who does that?
What's the
And
solution?
there's a solution out there, and then you think, oh, the solution neutralizes the problem and everything is good again. So I think a better way of thinking about the situation is kind of saying like what I would call overshoot or like the climate change, all these kind of things. That's context. Like it's so big. You, Betsy, and me, I, and even China as a whole cannot solve it. So it's a context in which we operate. So a better way maybe to say, given that context, what's your response? How do you respond to that context? So it makes it more actionable again, because otherwise we also think there has to be a first global agreement before we can do anything. And since global agreement is not possible, we can't do anything, and therefore nothing is possible. So it's really about, I think, being able to shift opportunities and the possibilities in a way that generate more desire, like to say, that's actually what I want, and like a sense of agency that you see a way to participate. And I think also curiosity because we don't really know the pathway how to get there and to see that as interesting rather than as stomping. So because if we don't know, that could be the most exciting thing because then you find out more. Like, and for some people, it's
I do
the
this.
worst. It's the worst thing because we don't know, therefore we can't do anything. So anyhow, so I think it's about that process, about the responses, and that's why I think kind of what does it mean to prepare yourself to that reality, and why is preparing yourself actually also good for the planet? And so it becomes an inquiry, so an interesting inquiry, and it also shows that it's not just one global problem; it's a multitude of local things and that we can build islands of survivability or sustainable, like islands of survivability that actually are positive for the planet. So to me, I think people say, what's the biggest thing we can do? There's so many answers you can say. What can you do? One is to say sleep more, because in the end, that if you sleep more, your brain is more functional, and then you start to see like what are good responses. What are useful responses? Because in the end, as I said before, I think our interest and sustainability is far more aligned,
Mhm.
far
And
more aligned.
yeah,
And we always kind of in this panic mode and say, oh no, unless we can convince everyone and their dog, we won't be able to move anything. And that's not the case. The less, as I'm repeating myself, the less others prepare themselves for this inevitable future, the more you, and I mean Betsy, you, and I mean you, viewer, are at risk. The more you have an incentive to prepare yourself for that future.
mostly our children and grandchildren. So I think every parent should tune in to Code Green. And
Please do.
I want to thank you, Matisse. And just one last comment, and that is, we're not the happiest country in the world, even though we're the world-class consumers and champions at that. The Scandinavian countries, you live in Switzerland, probably up there in the happiness factor. And it's not about stuff. It's about community. And that's what we need more of course, for every reason. Loneliness is an epidemic in this country. And all that research shows that we're like the 50th or something in terms of fulfillment. And so that should be a guidepost. That should be a signpost, right? To this is not theoretical. This is working. Now, of course, it's a different culture and size country and all that. And we have very dysfunctional politics, but so do some other countries right now. There's a lot to be said. Thank you for saying such wise things and for sharing once again this very important story that really everybody should know about. I wish there was a quiz that anybody who ran for any political office, be it local, regional, state, or national, especially president, you have to pass a basic science quiz, okay? And I wish CNBC and these networks that a lot of business people watch all day long, Wall Street or whatever, they should be talking about the concept of overshoot, right? And
And if you like to travel, then come and visit us. We have an interesting map at data.footprintnetwork.org where you can travel to all the countries virtually and look at what's their resource balance and how has it developed over time.
say that one more time, data at,
Data.footprintnetwork.org.
okay, I want to thank you for all your great work and I'm glad it's
Thank you.
continuing. We
Thank you,
need it.
Betsy.
And that's
Lovely
a resource. That's
engaging with you.
thank you. I every minute of it, in case you couldn't tell. Even though we're talking about problems, we're talking about solutions-ish. We're talking about it. And
Well,
that
yeah,
Renee Hayhoe will tell you that's the most important thing. Talk about it. But you can't talk to your neighbors, but that's
yeah.
not when Obama kept saying,
Yep.
talk to your neighbors. Well, your neighbors don't know more about climate change than you do. That was 50
Yeah,
years ago. They really didn't. We need to talk in places where people are tuning in. Promo,
absolutely. Yeah.
promo,
And
like,
that's them. What's their response? Because then it becomes interesting to learn from them, you know?
and
Doesn't mean that you have to do what they do, but it's kind of an interesting conversation.
I know the solutionaries that are the most knowledgeable, passionate, and engaging. I curate the best and the brightest, and there's more every day. And this is cheap. We didn't have to get on a plane to have this conversation. You can watch it. So you don't have to watch it. Listen while you're cooking dinner, cleaning up, whatever. Yes, there's a zillion podcasts out there, and thank God some of them are talking about these issues, but not enough reaching the mainstream. So go subscribe at my website with my hundreds of radio shows, betsyrosenberg.com. That will get you the weekly newsletter that will announce you being on and a little description of your work and how important it is. And then also, now that I have a YouTube channel, go to YouTube at Betsy Rosenberg Interviews, subscribe, and you'll get it right there, a link, every week, because it's not about me. It's not about you. It's
Yeah.
about all of us, mostly our beloved children and those to come.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.